Today we're going to continue chapter 14 and we're going to look at section number 2. Section number 2 in the text is really a continuation of what we started with, looking at the commercial revolution, how trade started to advance. But what the goal of today is understanding over the course of the medieval times how some of the changes took place. We're going to take a look at changes to medieval society today. One of the big changes was a growth in the food supply. To expand civilization, to expand population, you must have an increase in the food supply. One of the things that helped was the climate. There was an increase in the average temperature from 800 to 1200, which brought an increase in farm production. And horsepower also helped this out. We'll take a look at that next in capital letter B. The oxen were replaced by the horse. Now, the oxen were used prior to the horse because they're a little bit cheaper. They're very easy to care for, but they just move a little bit slower. The horse could plow up to 3 times more land in one day than the oxen. Now, what was needed before farmers could use a horse is a big question. It's a harness. It was invented in 900. It went around the entire horse's chest. That allowed the physical angle to be proper to where the horse could essentially plow the field. Another big change was called the 3-field system. Now, back in these times, you had 2 fields being replaced by 3 fields around 800. The 3-field system is where you had 2 fields that were planted and the other field lying fallow for the rest of the year. Now, each year you would then rotate which fields were growing and which fields were lying fallow. One field is going to be forced to grow in 2 consecutive years, and then that field would be the one that would be given the fallow or break the next year. Next, we'll take a look at a system called the guild system. A guild is an organization of individuals in the same business or job working to improve the economic and social conditions of its members. In the modern times, this sounds a lot like labor unions. Now, they started off as craft guilds. Craft guilds are where you had skilled artisans such as wheelwrights, glassmakers, winemakers, tailors, and even pharmacists sort of banding together to make their working conditions better. In crafts now, both the husband and the wife would usually work on the craft together. In some crafts, such as cloth making, women would actually form the majority. So what was the purpose of a guild? Well, the guild actually provides for worker regulations, wages, and conditions. So it's very much like a modern union. Your book does a really good job of explaining this. It's on page 388. Now, before we get there, though, I want to talk a brief history of surnames. Many people actually can trace their name, their last name or surname, back to a medieval occupation in Europe. The name Smith, for example, refers to someone who smites or works metals. The surname silversmith would belong to a person who worked with silver. In German-speaking areas, a smith was named a Schmidt. Someone who made goods out of wood was often surnamed carpenter. In French-speaking areas, a carpenter was called charpentier, while in German areas, the same person would be called Zimmermann. The last name Bollinger indicated a baker in France. A baker in Germany often had the surname Becker. So that's a little bit of history on surnames, last names, which were kind of coming into play during this time period. And here's about the guild system, okay? So for its members, it would set working conditions. It would give them some type of health insurance, which was pretty awesome, provided funeral expenses, provided dowries for poor children that are girls. To the community, it would build homes for victims of misfortune, help the poor, guaranteed quality work, took turns policing the streets, and donated windows to the church, for example. The guilds, though, you made your way through the guild as an apprentice. So you'd be an apprentice first. You trained for about 2 to 7 years. And then when you were trained properly, you would progress to being a journeyman or a day worker. As a journeyman, you would work 6 days a week. You would earn a salary, and you would have to become a member of the guild. You'd have to be accepted into the guild to become a master. A master would be the person who owns his own shop, employs the journeyman. They would work with other masters to protect the trade, and sometimes they would serve in civic government. So you had to kind of go through these stages to become a master in your field of the guild. During all of this, we had something called the Commercial Revolution going on. This was simply the expansion of trade and business. Now, when you think about revolution, they're not always involving war. For example, here, you're just talking about changes to trade and business life. Something that was going on quite commonly during this time are called fairs and trade. Trade took place in towns on what are called fair days. Peasants would bring goods from their manor, from the Lord's land that they worked on, and they would take it to the town to try and trade. Today, we have something similar. It's called a farmer's market. Okay, so you go into town and the farmers in the region or the area will bring their products and then they will sell them. The amount of trade routes also increased due to foreign areas and foreign lands doing some of the same practices, and having different resources and environmental factors led to cultural diffusion of different items. Business and banking started to happen around this time as well. Many different currencies and coinage systems were developing. Letters of credit were established between merchants. This is like the early form of a credit card or a check. But there was something called the sin of usury. The Catholic Church forbade Christians to lend money and charge interest. It was known as the sin of usury. Therefore, money lending and banking became, in a large part, the job for many European Jewish practitioners. Societal changes included new jobs that were being developed based on new technology that was happening, and also new cities where people came to live and flourish. And this led to the flourish of urban life or the prosperity of cities. Capital A talks about population growth. Between 1000 and 1150, the population of Western Europe began to rise from about 30 million to 42 million total. Trade and town growth started to exhibit as well. As trade grew, towns in Europe grew, and new towns arose. Some of the drawbacks to living in towns and cities would be narrow streets, animals and their excrement. They did not have sewers, so human excrement and garbage were simply dumped into the streets. This is one of the factors that eventually lead to the plague. People never really bathed. Homes lacked fresh air, light, and clean water. Many people came into towns at this time. Even serfs began to attempt running away from their masters or lords. Now, a serf could earn their freedom by living in a town for 1 year plus 1 day. So once you lived in a town for that long, you were considered free from your lord's control. Next is capital C. We'll talk about the merchant class shifting the social order. Merchants didn't really fit into the noble, clergy, peasant social class system because they're kind of outside the manor life and outside the ideology of feudalism. So there was a merchant class called burghers. The burghers were town dwellers that they didn't want any interference from noble lords in the towns. They wanted to be free from lords trying to charge some taxes and trying to govern and rule over their towns. Finally, today, we'll talk about the revival of education. There is a Muslim connection here. In the 1100s, Christian scholars began to visit Muslim libraries in southern Spain. The scholars are most interested in the works of Greek philosophers. They studied science, philosophy, law, math, and the liberal arts. Muslim technology in ships, navigation, and weaponry were also major components for scholars. One of the reasons they needed to travel to Muslim libraries is going all the way back to chapter 10. Remember, it was the Muslim scholars that began to translate the ancient Greek and Roman texts. One thing that is new in this time period, one of the changes, is that scholars began to go to universities. The first European universities were in Paris, France, and Bologna, Italy in the 1100s. Oxford, England, a very famous school today, and Salerno, Italy also built universities. The people who were attending these universities were most often the sons of burghers or well-off artisans. Sometimes they were the sons of nobles and lords. Most students went to college for jobs that they could get in government or to be a member of the church, such as a priest or clergy member. Most of the universities taught in what was called the common vernacular, which was the everyday language of a homeland, such as English in England, French in France, Spanish in Spain, so on and so forth. Famous writers came about during this time period, such as Dante, who one of his most famous works is the Divine Comedy. It was written in Italian, and Chaucer with the Canterbury Tales written in English. Those are examples of works in the common vernacular. A female named Christine de Pizan wrote the Book of the City of Ladies in 1405 in French. Works written in vernacular brought literature to the masses since many could not read Latin, so this led to a revival of education as well. St. Thomas Aquinas and the medieval philosophy is also something to take a look at here with the revival of education. Thomas Aquinas argued that most basic religious truths could be proven through logical argument. Most popular Roman Catholic philosopher was Thomas Aquinas. He worked on bridging the gap between religion and also philosophy. His followers were generally called the scholastics. This means schoolmen. Scholars like Aquinas who met at great universities to discuss and debate the issues of their time. Those were the scholastics. Those are some of the things that they did during this time period. And one of the major changes of all of these changes that we talked about in the medieval times was the expansion of education.